The winter wind came down from the high plains like a warning no one could stop, rattling the loose boards of the little wooden cabin and slipping through every crack as if it had business inside. Snow had been falling since dawn, soft at first, then harder, until the world beyond the frosted window disappeared into a pale blur. Inside, the air smelled of lamp oil, iron, and the sharp, clean scent of boiled linens. A fire struggled in the stone hearth, popping weakly, throwing long, trembling shadows across the rough walls. It should have felt like a night for quiet prayers and gentle beginnings. Instead, it felt like the end of something. On the narrow bed near the window, a young mother lay propped against thin pillows, her dark hair damp against her temples, her face pale from hours of pain and effort. In her arms rested two tiny bundles wrapped in worn white cloth, their small faces barely visible beneath the folds. She looked down at them with the kind of wonder that comes only once in a lifetime, the kind that hurts because it is so full. Tears slid silently into her hairline, but her mouth trembled into a tired smile. Across the room stood her husband, broad-shouldered, tall, and rigid, as a fence post driven too deep into frozen ground. His boots were still dusted with snow, melting into dark patches on the wooden floor. He had not taken off his coat. He had not come close to the bed. The lamplight carved hard lines into his face, making him look older, harsher, like a man carved from dry timber rather than flesh. In one fist he crushed a folded paper, creasing it again and again, as though it were something alive he meant to strangle. The midwife lingered near the door, wringing her hands in her apron, sensing something was terribly wrong but unsure whether to speak. She had delivered babies in blizzards, droughts, and candlelit barns, had seen men faint and women scream and families rejoice. She had never felt a silence this heavy, like the air before lightning strikes. "They're beautiful," the mother whispered hoarsely, her voice soft but steady. She turned one of the bundles slightly, as if offering him a better look. "Come see them." He did not move. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin so hard the window rattled in its frame. A loose shutter banged over and over, like a heartbeat gone wild. "Come here," she said again, a little louder, hope threading through exhaustion. "They're strong. Both of them. You have sons." Something flickered in his eyes then, but not pride, not relief, something darker, something cold. He took one slow step forward, then another, each footfall heavy enough to creak the floorboards. When he reached the foot of the bed, he looked down at the twins as though they were strangers who had wandered in uninvited. The mother's smile faded. Her fingers tightened protectively around the bundles. "They look just like you," she added quickly, searching his face, trying to find the man she loved behind the stone expression. Same hair, same mouth, just smaller. The lamp flame fluttered, dimming for a second before brightening again. And in that flicker, the truth became impossible to ignore. The baby's skin, soft and new as rose petals, held a deeper shade than either of their parents. Not by much. Not enough for a stranger to question in passing, but enough for a husband who had spent 9 long months building dreams in his mind. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. Midwife shifted uneasily. "Children don't always favor their parents right away," she offered gently. "Color can change. Features settle with time." He did not even glance at her. The mother's heart began to pound, a dull thud of dread spreading through her chest. "They're ours," she said quickly, her voice cracking now. "I swear to you, they're ours." "You know they are." For a moment, something like pain crossed his face, raw and human. Then it hardened into something sharper than anger, something wounded pride turns into when it has nowhere else to go. "I'm divorcing you," he roared, the words exploding through the small cabin so violently that one of the babies startled and began to cry. His mother flinched as if struck. "What are you saying? You heard me?" His voice shook, not with uncertainty, but with fury so deep it rattled his bones. He lifted the crumpled paper in his hand, shaking it at her. "I built a life for us. I gave you everything I had, and this is what you give me back." Her tears came faster now, hot and helpless. "I never betrayed you, never. You're the only man I've ever loved." But he was no longer listening. Something inside him had already decided, already judged, already closed the door. He turned away from the bed as though the sight of her burned his eyes. The smaller twin began to wail too, their thin cries weaving together into a fragile sound that filled the room with heartbreak. The mother rocked them instinctively, whispering soft promises through her sobs, pressing her cheek against their tiny heads as if she could shield them from the storm inside and out. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, desperation clawing into every word. "Please, just look at them again. Look at me." He stopped near the door, his back still turned. For one long second, it seemed he might. His shoulders rose and fell, breath heavy, fists opening and closing at his sides. The midwife held her own breath, afraid even the sound of it might shatter the moment. But he did not turn around. "Pack whatever you need," he said flatly, his voice now emptied of heat, emptied of feeling. "You won't stay here?" The words fell like stones into deep water, leaving ripples that would never fully fade. Outside, the wind howled louder, swirling snow against the walls as if trying to bury the cabin where it stood. Inside, the mother felt something inside her break clean in two. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet fracture that changed the shape of everything. She looked down at her sons, at their tiny faces scrunched with tears, at their small fists opening and closing in blind search for comfort. A fierce, trembling love rose in her chest, stronger than fear, stronger than shame, stronger even than the man who had once been her whole world. "Then we'll go," she whispered to them, though her eyes never left the doorway where her husband stood like a stranger. "We'll go somewhere far away, somewhere safe." He opened the door. A blast of icy air swept in, snapping the lamp flame sideways and scattering sparks from the hearth. Snow blew across the floor like white ash. For a heartbeat, he hesitated on the threshold, and he stepped out into the storm and pulled the door shut behind him. The cabin fell into a silence so deep it felt sacred, broken only by the soft crying of the twins and the mother's uneven breathing. The midwife finally moved, crossing the room to kneel beside the bed, placing a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. "You're not alone," she said softly, though her eyes were wet too. But the mother did not answer. She stared at the closed door, at the place where her life had just walked out into the snow. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and fear and exhaustion, a quiet resolve began to grow, slow but unstoppable, like roots pushing through frozen earth. 20 years later, on a warm evening, when the past should have been nothing more than a fading memory, two figures would step onto the dusty road leading back to that same cabin. They would not come as frightened children or abandoned sons. They would come as men shaped by years of questions, by love that had survived without answers, by a truth no one in that valley was ready to face. And the man who once slammed that door would finally learn that some storms do not end when the snow stops falling. Some return, patient and relentless, until every secret is uncovered and every heart is forced to remember what it tried to forget. By the time the snow melted and the rivers swelled with spring water, the cabin no longer looked like a home. Smoke rarely rose from the chimney, and the yard that once held chopped wood and careful footprints lay empty except for wind-blown straw and a broken bucket half buried in mud. Neighbors whispered that the man inside had turned into a ghost while still breathing. He worked his land, sold his grain, spoke only when necessary, and shut his door before sunset as if night itself were an enemy. His name was Thorne Blackridge, and before that winter he had been known as a man of fierce loyalty and quiet strength. He had built the cabin with his own hands, hauled each log from the forest, carved every notch, set every stone in the hearth. Folks said he loved his wife the way a man loves the ground that feeds him, steady and unquestioned. After she left, that steadiness hardened into something brittle. He stopped going to town gatherings, stopped playing the fiddle on warm evenings. Even the horses seemed uneasy around him, snorting and stamping as though they sensed the storm he carried inside. What no one knew was that every night he unfolded the same wrinkled paper he had crushed in his fist that night. It was not a letter of betrayal, not proof of anything at all. It was a drawing, faded now, of two tiny cradles sketched by his wife months before the birth. She had laughed while showing it to him, her eyes shining, saying she felt in her bones they would have twins. He had kissed her forehead and teased that one baby would be trouble enough. He kept that drawing hidden in a wooden box beneath his bed, along with a lock of her dark hair tied with blue thread and a silver locket she had forgotten the day she left. He never opened the locket. He was afraid of what he might find inside, afraid it would shatter the fragile lie that kept him standing. It was easier to believe anger than grief. Anger kept a man upright. Grief hollowed him out. Miles away, Beyond 2 rivers and a stretch of prairie where the grass grew taller than a horse's back, the woman he had cast out built a life that few would have believed possible. Her name was Alara Voss, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made strangers think she must come from wealth or noble blood. Though she owned little more than a small house and a patch of land barely large enough for a garden, she had arrived in the town of Red Hollow at the end of winter, thin, exhausted, and carrying 2 infants wrapped against her chest. The midwife who had helped deliver them had ridden with her part of the way, refusing to let her travel alone through snowdrifts with newborns. After that, a trader's wagon had given her a lift, then a kind widow had taken her in until she could stand on her own feet. It was never charity she wanted, it was time. Raising twins alone in those years demanded a strength that burned through sleep, youth, and sometimes hope itself. Alara worked wherever she could, sewing torn coats, washing linens, tending sick children, cooking for ranch hands during harvest season. At night, she rocked her sons beside a small stove, humming songs her own mother had once sung, refusing to let bitterness touch the tenderness in her voice. She named them Orion and Cassian, names that sounded like destiny whispered into the dark. From the beginning, they were different from other children, not just in the shade of their skin, but in the way they watched the world, alert and thoughtful, as if trying to understand a puzzle no one had explained. Orion, the older by minutes, had a steady gaze and a quiet manner, speaking only when he had something worth saying. Cassian carried fire in his spirit, quick to laugh, quick to defend, quick to challenge anyone who underestimated them. When they were old enough to ask about their father, Alara did not lie. She told them he had once loved them before he even knew their faces. She told them he had been strong and brave and proud, a man who built things that lasted. What she never told them was why he had turned away, because she did not know how to shape that pain into words that would not wound them. "Does he know we're alive?" Cassian asked once, his small fists clenched at his sides. Alara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, he knows. Then why didn't he come?" Orion asked, his voice softer, but somehow harder to bear. She pulled them both into her arms, pressing her cheek against their hair. Sometimes grown men make mistakes they don't know how to fix. As the years passed, the twins grew into young men who turned heads wherever they went, not only because of their striking looks or powerful build, but because they moved with the confidence of those who had learned early that the world would not hand them anything. They worked harder, spoke clearer, stood taller. People in Red Hollow trusted them with difficult tasks, dangerous jobs, things that required both strength and honor. Yet a shadow followed them, an unspoken question that lingered in every room they entered. Strangers would glance from one brother to the other, curiosity flickering in their eyes, then look away too quickly. Children sometimes asked blunt questions adults were too polite to voice. Orion answered calmly when he chose to answer at all. Cassian answered with a sharp edge that warned people not to pry. On the evening of their 20th birthday, Alara prepared a simple meal, lighting 2 candles instead of 1, her hands trembling just enough for Orion to notice. The small house glowed warm against the deepening dusk, the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the air. It should have been a night of celebration, yet a strange quiet hung over the table. "You've been watching the road all day," Cassian said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Expecting someone?" Alara forced a smile. "Just thinking." Orion reached across the table and took her hand, his touch gentle but steady. "You don't have to carry everything alone." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she rose, crossed the room, and opened a small wooden chest she had kept locked for as long as they could remember. From inside, she took a folded cloth bundle and brought it back to the table. "I always hoped I wouldn't need to show you this," she said quietly. Inside the cloth lay a silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful, and a piece of paper worn thin along the creases. Orion unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing of 2 cradles, sketched with loving detail, the lines smudged where tears had once fallen. "Your father kept this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He made it for us." Cassian's expression hardened. "Then he threw us away anyway." Alara closed her eyes, pain flashing across her face. "He did not throw you away because he did not want you. He threw us away because he believed something that broke his heart." Neither brother spoke. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Orion looked up. Where is he? She met his gaze, and for the first time in 20 years, the wall she had built around that memory cracked wide open. Blackridge Valley, she said. The name hung in the air like thunder waiting to fall. Within days, the twins had made their decision. They packed lightly, said little, and prepared the horses before dawn. Alara stood in the doorway watching them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if holding herself together. Whatever happens, she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay strong, do not let anger guide you. Cassian swung into the saddle. We just want answers. Orion leaned down, pressing his forehead briefly to hers, in a gesture so tender it stole her breath. We'll come back, he promised. As they rode away, dust rising behind them in a golden cloud, Alara felt the same cold fear she had felt the night she left the cabin in the snow. Some journeys did not lead forward or back, but straight into the heart of everything one tried to escape. Far ahead, beyond hills and rivers and years of silence, Thorn Blackridge stepped out of his cabin one evening and paused, frowning at the distant road. Two figures moved there, small against the setting sun, but growing larger with each passing minute. Something deep in his chest tightened, an instinct older than reason, older than memory. He did not yet know that the past he had buried was riding straight toward him, carrying faces that looked like echoes of a life he had tried desperately to forget. Thorn Blackridge stood at the edge of his porch, long after the sun dipped below the hills, watching the road as if it had spoken to him in a language only he could hear. The sky burned copper and gold, then slowly faded into bruised purple. Usually he went inside before dark, barred the door, and let the night pass without witness. That evening he did not move. The two riders had disappeared behind a ridge hours ago, yet a restless unease prowled through him like a caged animal. He told himself it was nothing. Travelers passed through from time to time, traders, drifters, ranch hands chasing work, but something about the way they had moved together, steady and unhurried, had stirred an old instinct he had spent years trying to silence. They had not ridden like men searching for a place to sleep. They had ridden like men who knew exactly where they were going. Inside the cabin, the air felt thick. He lit the lamp and poured himself coffee that had gone bitter from sitting too long on the stove. The familiar objects around him should have brought comfort. The table he had carved, the rifle above the mantel, the chair where his wife once sat mending shirts. Instead, they seemed to watch him with silent accusation. Without meaning to, he crossed to the wooden box beneath his bed and opened it. The drawing of the twin cradles lay on top, fragile as dried leaves. Beneath it rested the locket. His fingers hovered over it for a long moment before finally lifting it free. The metal felt cold, heavier than something so small had any right to be. Outside, a horse snorted. Thorn froze. The sound came again, unmistakable, followed by the soft jingle of tack. Someone had stopped near the well. His heart slammed once, hard enough to make his vision blur. He set the locket down slowly, as though sudden movement might shatter the moment, then reached for the rifle out of pure habit. Not fear, never fear, just caution. When he stepped onto the porch, the moon had risen high enough to silver the yard. Two horses stood near the fence, heads lowered, steam drifting from their nostrils. Beside them were the riders he had glimpsed before sunset. Up close, they were not boys. They were grown men, tall and broad, their silhouettes strong against the pale ground. One stood with arms folded, weight balanced easily on one leg, watching the cabin with open challenge. The other rested a calming hand on his horse's neck, his posture quieter but no less solid. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the calmer one stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. Moonlight touched his face, revealing features so familiar that Thorn's breath caught painfully in his throat. The line of the jaw, the shape of the eyes. Even the way he held his shoulders carried an echo of someone Thorn had not allowed himself to remember in years. "We're looking for Thorn Blackridge," the young man said, his voice low and steady. Thorn tightened his grip on the rifle. "You found him. What do you want?" Second brother let out a short, humorless laugh, straight to the point. "Good." "Cassian," the first one murmured, a quiet warning. Thorn's gaze snapped between them. The name struck something deep inside him, like distant thunder rolling across an empty sky. "We came a long way," the calm one continued. "We just need a few answers." Answers cost something, Thorn said flatly. And I don't owe strangers anything. Cassian stepped forward, anger sparking in his eyes. You owe more than you think. Orion caught his arm before he could say more. The simple touch spoke of years of understanding between them, of battles fought side by side. Please, Orion said to Thorn. We're not here to cause trouble. Trouble had already arrived, Thorn thought. It had ridden in on 2 horses and spoken with voices that stirred ghosts he had buried with his own hands. Say what you came to say, he said. Then be on your way. Orion drew a slow breath. Our mother's name is Alara Voss. The world seemed to tilt. For a heartbeat, Thorn forgot how to breathe. The name moved through him like a blade sliding between ribs, clean and merciless. He had not heard it spoken aloud in 20 years, not by another human voice. Cassian watched his reaction closely, satisfaction flickering through his anger. Thought that might get your attention? Thorn forced himself to stand still, though his pulse roared in his ears. I don't know anyone by that name. It was a lie so thin it barely held shape. Orion's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened. She told us you might say that. Then she wasted your time. Cassian's restraint snapped. She nearly died bringing us into this world, and you cast her out like she meant nothing. The words slammed into the night, echoing off the cabin walls. One of the horses shied nervously, stamping the ground. Thorn's grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles blanched. Rage flared, hot and defensive, rising to smother the fear beneath it. Watch your mouth, boy. I'm not a boy, Cassian shot back. I'm the son you abandoned. Silence fell so abruptly, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the valley. Orion closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact, then stepped forward until he stood directly below the porch. Up close, the resemblance became undeniable, not just to Thorn, but to the woman he had loved. The same strength in the brow, the same quiet endurance in the set of his mouth. You didn't come for revenge, Orion said softly. Came because not knowing has been a weight our whole lives. We need the truth. Thorn's chest ached, a deep, crushing pressure that had nothing to do with age or fatigue. The past stood before him in flesh and bone, asking questions he had spent decades avoiding, questions that had no answers simple enough to ease the damage. I have no sons, he said, each word forced through clenched teeth. Cassian stared at him in disbelief, pain flashing across his face before anger swallowed it. You don't even want to look at us. Thorn did look then. Really look. The moonlight revealed the truth he had feared since the moment he saw them on the road. They were living proof of something he had never understood, something he had chosen to condemn rather than face. And yet beneath everything else, he saw traces of himself. The height, the shoulders, the stubborn fire that refused to bend. Something inside him cracked, but he held the pieces together with sheer will. Leave, he said hoarsely. Before I make you, neither brother moved. Behind them, clouds drifted across the moon, dimming the light until the world felt smaller, closer, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. Orion spoke again, his voice almost gentle. She never stopped loving you. The words struck harder than any accusation. Thorn's throat tightened painfully. He wanted to shout that love had not been enough, that betrayal had poisoned everything. But doubt crept in, quiet and relentless, whispering that perhaps he had never truly known the truth at all. Cassian's voice broke, raw with emotion he could no longer hide. She kept your locket. She kept that drawing. She defended you every time someone spoke badly of you, even when she had nothing. Images flooded Thorn's mind, memories he had tried to burn away. Her laughter in summer sunlight. Her hand in his while they planned a future that had seemed unbreakable. The softness in her eyes when she told him she was carrying his child. Children, he corrected silently, the words slicing through him. A distant roll of thunder sounded beyond the hills, though the sky remained clear above them. The air smelled faintly of rain that had not yet arrived. We're not leaving, Orion, said quietly. Not until you tell us why. Thorn looked from one brother to the other, seeing not strangers but consequences. The storm he had outrun had finally caught up, patient and unstoppable. Somewhere deep inside the cabin, the lamp flame flickered as a gust of wind slipped through the cracks, whispering through empty rooms that had waited 20 years for voices to return. On the porch, Thorn Blackridge lowered the rifle slightly, his arms suddenly heavy, his certainty crumbling like dry earth under rain. But the truth lodged in his throat like a stone, too sharp to swallow, too painful to speak. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath their boots. A wind swept down from the hills, lifting dust and dead leaves into restless spirals that circled the yard like spirits searching for a way in. Orion and Cassian stood firm below the porch, their shadows stretching long and dark across the pale earth, while Thorn Blackridge remained above them, caught between the past behind him and the truth waiting in front of him. For 20 years he had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, though he would never have admitted it even to himself. In every version he remained strong, unshaken, certain of his choice. But the reality was nothing like that. The reality was two men with his blood in their veins and a storm pressing down on all of them, making it impossible to breathe without remembering. Cassian took another step forward, boots crunching on gravel. "You keep saying you don't have sons. Look at us and say that again." Thorn did not answer. His eyes had fixed on Orion's face, searching it as if it were a map that might finally explain everything. There was kindness there, unmistakable. The kind Alara had carried even when the world had given her nothing in return. That gentleness hurt more than anger ever could. Orion climbed the 2 steps to the porch slowly, giving Thorn time to stop him. Thorn did not move, up close. The resemblance struck with brutal clarity. Not exact, not a mirror, but a continuation. A life that might have been lived beside him instead of far away. "I don't hate you," Orion said quietly. Even now, Cassian let out a disbelieving breath behind him. "Speak for yourself." Orion glanced back at his brother, not with reprimand, but with understanding. "We came for truth, not revenge." Thorn's voice came out rough, like gravel dragged across stone. "Truth won't give you what you think it will." "Maybe not," Orion said. But silence already took enough. The wind rose suddenly, slamming the cabin door against its frame with a loud crack. All 3 men flinched instinctively. The storm that had been gathering beyond the hills was finally breaking loose. Dark clouds rolling overhead like a living wall. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the valley in harsh white for a split second. Cassian moved closer too, stepping onto the porch as rain began to spit from the sky. "You don't get to shut us out again." The words struck deeper than he intended. Shut us out again, as if they had been inside once. You belonged there. Inside the cabin, the lamp flame guttered violently as another gust forced its way through the gaps in the logs. The room felt suddenly too small, too crowded with memories that had no place to hide. Thorn turned away from them at last and walked inside, his steps heavy. For a moment the brothers thought he meant to escape, to lock them out as he had locked out the world for 2 decades. Then his voice came from the darkness. "If you're coming in, shut the door." Cassian and Orion exchanged a glance, surprise flickering between them, then followed. The door closed behind them with a solid thud, cutting off the wind, but not the sound of rain beginning to fall in earnest. Drumming on the roof like impatient fingers, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else beneath it all, something lonely. Ryan's gaze moved slowly across the room, taking in the worn table, the single chair, the neatly stacked firewood, the bed pushed against the far wall. It did not look like a home built for one man. It looked like a place waiting for someone who never returned. The empty second chair first. He did not say anything, but his jaw tightened. Thorn set the rifle against the wall and leaned both hands on the table, head bowed as if the weight of the room had finally settled onto his shoulders. For a long time he said nothing. The only sound was the storm outside and the brothers' breathing, steady but tense. "You think I wanted this?" he said at last, his voice barely audible. Cassian stepped forward. "We don't know what you wanted. You never gave us the chance." Thorn laughed, a hollow sound that held no humor at all. "Chance." He lifted his head slowly, eyes red but dry. "I watched everything I believed in collapse in one night." There was no chance left. Orion's expression softened, though his posture remained firm. "Then tell us what you saw. What made you believe she betrayed you?" Lightning flashed again, this time close enough to shake the windows. For an instant the room blazed white, freezing all 3 men in stark detail. When the darkness returned, it felt thicker than before. Thorn's gaze drifted to the wooden box beneath the bed. Orion noticed the movement immediately. Without asking, he crossed the room and knelt, opening it carefully.
Cowboy.
Inside lay the drawing of the twin cradles, the locket, the lock of hair tied with blue thread. Cassian stared.
You kept these?
Thorn's voice broke for the first time. Kept everything. Orion picked up the locket, turning it gently in his fingers. The metal had been polished by years of handling, though no one had opened it. May I? Thorn's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at him to say no, to stop this before the fragile wall he had built crumbled completely. But another part of him, buried deep beneath pride and fear, wanted to know too. He nodded once. Orion pressed the clasp. It resisted at first, then gave with a soft click that sounded louder than thunder in the silent room. Cassian leaned in, eyes sharp, breath held. Thorn could not move. His entire body had gone rigid, as if bracing for a blow that would either kill him or set him free. Orion opened the locket. His expression changed instantly, shock widening his eyes. This Cassian grabbed it from his hand, staring inside. Anger drained from his face, replaced by something raw and uncertain. This doesn't make sense. Thorn's heart pounded so hard he felt dizzy. What is it? Neither brother answered right away. They looked at each other, silent communication passing between them, the kind only twins seemed to possess. Outside, rain hammered the roof, drowning the valley in sound. Tell me, Thorn demanded, voice cracking. Orion closed the locket slowly, as if afraid it might vanish. When he looked up, his eyes shone with emotion too complex to name. You really never knew. Knew what? Cassian swallowed hard, anger now tangled with something like grief. If this is true, then everything you believed, everything she suffered. A deafening crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead, shaking the cabin so violently dust fell from the rafters. The lamp flickered wildly, nearly going out before steadying again. In that trembling light, Thorn Blackridge saw not enemies or strangers, but two men standing on the edge of the same truth he had feared for half his life. What did she never tell me? He whispered, dread and hope colliding in his chest. Orion stepped forward, holding the locket between them, his hand shaking despite his effort to stay composed. You need to hear it from her. The words hit harder than any revelation. Cassian nodded slowly, eyes dark with emotion. She deserves that much. The storm raged outside, wind clawing at the walls, rain turning the yard into mud, lightning tearing the sky open again and again, as if trying to force the world to look at what had been hidden too long. Thorn sank into the chair, suddenly looking older than his years, like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him might not be solid after all. She's alive, he said. Not a question, but a fragile hope he barely dared to voice. Orion met his gaze. She's waiting. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, suspended between past and future, between guilt and forgiveness, between the man who had slammed the door and the man who might still have time to open it again. Outside, the storm showed no sign of passing. For a long time, Thorn Blackridge could not speak. The storm outside had begun to soften, rain easing from a violent drumbeat into a steady fall, but inside the cabin everything felt louder than before. His own breathing sounded harsh in his ears. The ticking of cooling metal on the stove felt like a clock measuring the last seconds of the life he had known. She's alive, he repeated, as if saying it again might make it more real. Orion nodded gently. She never stopped believing you would come back to her. Cassian looked away toward the window, jaw tight, fighting emotions he did not want to show. She said love doesn't disappear just because someone walks away. The words struck deep, stirring memories Thorn had buried under years of stubborn pride. Elara laughing beside the river. Elara leaning into his shoulder during long rides home. Lara whispering plans about children, about growing old in that very cabin. He had tried to erase those memories, convinced they were poisoned. Now they came rushing back, clear and bright, leaving him shaken. Why didn't she come herself? He asked hoarsely. Orion hesitated. She wanted to. Many times. But she was afraid seeing you would break her all over again. She told us if you still hated her, she would rather remember you as the man who once loved her. Cassian finally faced him again, eyes shining with unshed tears. She never remarried, never even considered it. That hurt more than anything else. Not because of guilt alone, but because of what it revealed. 20 years of loneliness he had thought he alone carried. 20 years she had carried too. Thorn stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly across the floor. "Where is she?" "In Red Hollow," Orion answered. 2 days' ride. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, moving away at last. The storm was leaving, but inside Thorn something far more dangerous had begun. Hope. It felt fragile, terrifying, like holding a flame in trembling hands. He grabbed his coat, movements urgent, almost frantic. Then he stopped, turning back to the brothers with uncertainty written plainly across his face. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" Cassian let out a rough breath. "You think she sent us all this way for nothing?" Orion stepped closer, placing a steady hand on Thorn's shoulder, a gesture so natural it startled them both. "She's waited half her life. Go to her." They rode out at first light. The valley glistened under a washed, clean sky, every leaf and blade of grass sparkling with leftover rain. The air smelled fresh, alive, as if the world itself approved of the journey. Thorn rode ahead at times, then fell back, restless energy driving him faster than the horses should go. Orion and Cassian kept pace easily, their presence both grounding and surreal. Sons, the word still felt too large to hold. As they crossed the prairie, Cassian spoke for the first time in hours. "Why did you never open the locket?" Thorn did not slow. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of finding proof. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air, heavy but honest. Cassian considered it, anger softening into something more complicated. "You lost 20 years because of fear, I know." Orion glanced between them, relief flickering quietly. The tension that had once burned between father and sons was cooling, not gone, but no longer sharp enough to cut. They reached Red Hollow near sunset. It was a small town, peaceful, with tidy homes and smoke curling lazily from chimneys. Children played near the well, laughter floating on the warm air. Thorn's heart pounded harder with every step his horse took down the main street. "There," Orion said softly. A small house stood at the edge of town, framed by wildflowers and a white fence slightly crooked with age. Light glowed warmly from the windows. It looked nothing like the grand future Thorn had once promised her, yet it held a quiet beauty that made his chest ache. He dismounted slowly, legs suddenly unsteady. For a moment he could not move. What if she had changed beyond recognition? What if she had learned to live without him so completely? There was no place left for him now. Cassian opened the gate, the hinges creaking softly. "Come on," he said, not unkindly. Thorn walked up the short path, as if approaching something sacred. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the door, his hand hovered over the wood, trembling. It opened before he could knock. Laravos stood there, older, silver threaded through her dark hair, lines at the corners of her eyes carved by years of both sorrow and quiet joy. But it was unmistakably her. The same gentle strength, the same warmth that once made him believe the world was a good place. For a long moment neither spoke. Her gaze moved over his face, searching, disbelieving, then filling with tears that spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Thorn, hearing his name and her voice again, broke something open inside him completely. "Alara," he whispered, the words shaking apart as it left his lips. She lifted a hand as if to touch him, then stopped halfway, fear flashing across her expression. "If this is a dream, I don't want to wake up." "It's not a dream," he said, voice raw. "I came to bring you home, if you'll let me." Her breath caught, a small broken sound. "Home." "I was wrong," he said simply. "I let pride and fear destroy everything we built. I hurt you. I hurt our sons. And I have lived with that emptiness every day since." Orion and Cassian stood back by the gate, giving them space, though neither could look away. Alara studied his face, as if searching for any trace of the man who had turned her out into the snow. What she saw instead made her shoulders tremble. Not anger, not coldness, just regret and love worn thin by time. "She kept the drawing," she said softly. "I kept everything." Her hand finally reached his cheek, fingertips brushing the rough stubble there, as if proving he was real. The touch made him close his eyes, leaning into it like a man who had been starved of warmth for too long. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Neither did I," he answered. Behind them, Cassian exhaled a long breath he had not realized he was holding. Orion placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, a quiet reassurance that something important had just healed. Alara stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come inside." Thorn crossed the threshold slowly, overwhelmed by the simple act. It felt like stepping into a future he had once thrown away and somehow been given back. The house smelled of fresh bread and lavender. A small fire burned in the hearth. It was not the life they had planned, but it was a life filled with care and resilience. Later, as night settled gently over Red Hollow, the four of them sat together around the table, talking not just of the past, but of the years they had missed. There were tears and quiet laughter and long pauses where words were not needed. Outside, the sky cleared completely, stars appearing one by one, bright and steady. Thorn realized then that forgiveness was not a single moment, but a path walked together, step by step. He had lost 20 years, but not everything. Love, it seemed, could survive even the worst storms if someone was brave enough to return. When Alara finally rested her head against his shoulder, comfortable and trusting as she once had, he felt a peace deeper than anything he had known before. Orion and Cassian watched them with soft smiles, the last pieces of a broken family fitting back into place. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, and the sound carried across the quiet fields like a blessing. The storm that had begun on the night of the twins' birth had finally passed, leaving behind not ruin, but a stronger, kinder dawn. Tell us in the comments how you liked the story and where you are watching from. If the story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel to stay with us for more exciting stories.